So would you, if you're able to, please turn again to Mark chapter 8 and those first 21 verses. How many of you, I wonder, have had that experience of what's called deja vu? When something happens to you or someone says something, you think, I've heard that before, or I've been here before, and you try and place where it was, and you think you've almost gone through a time warp, don't you? And you think, did this happen before? Well, I got that experience this morning because I was looking at this passage and I thought, the last time I spoke up here was 5 weeks ago, and it was the feeding of the 5,000. And I thought, wait a minute, I've had this before, right? And I thought, well, yes, it has happened before. It did really happen, rather than just deja vu. But it's uncanny here how many words are repeated from that previous chapter, chapter 6, and verses 30 to 44. Jesus asks, how many loaves do you have? He asks exactly the same question back in chapter 6. The people are told to sit down. He tells them here to sit down. He gives thanks, breaks bread, and gives it to the disciples to distribute to them. Exactly the same thing happened in chapter 6 with the 5,000. It tells us here that people ate and were satisfied. And it says the same thing in chapter 6. The broken pieces are collected at the end as well. It's almost like a rerun, isn't it? In actual fact, it's not just that, but if you've been following this series, bread is everywhere from chapter 6 to chapter 8, it seems. Just go back to chapter 6 for a moment, and after the feeding of the 5,000, you think you finish that in verse 44, but then you find in verse 52, Mark says they had not understood about the loaves. So he refers back to that again in verse 52. Chapter 7 ends up all about food. Not specifically bread, but it's all about food and food laws. Look at verse 19, for instance. Jesus talks about for food doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach and then out of his body. And in saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. And he goes on to talk about that again. And in verse 27, he meets the Syrophoenician woman, and he says to her, right out of the blue, let the children first eat all they want to, he said, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to their dogs. And then she says, of course, as you remember from last week, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So again, bread is on the menu, as it were. And then this passage, of course, we have another 4,000 being fed. And in verse 14, when that's finished, what does it say? The disciples had forgotten to bring bread. And when Jesus says, look out for the yeast of the Pharisees, they discuss among themselves and say, it's because we have no bread. And bread continues throughout that passage to the end of what Jean Mary read earlier. So bread is really important here. And we must be thinking to ourselves, what are we being told here? Why is Jesus repeating the feeding? Well, not 5,000 here, but 4,000. What is he trying to get through to us? Actually, although there are very many similarities between the 4,000 and the 5,000, there are also some important differences as well. They are 4 rather than 5,000 at the start. In the 5,000, the disciples said to Jesus, look, all these people here, they're all hungry, send them away. Here, it's Jesus who starts the conversation. He says, I've got compassion on these people. In the previous episode, they're with him for just one day, and it's coming to the evening. Here, Jesus says they've been with me for 3 days. And at the end, of course, there are 7 basketfuls of leftovers. There were 12 in the previous passage. So those people who say, well, actually, Mark just forgot, and he just wrote the same thing twice, that can't be right, because the details are different. And there's something very important here, I think, in verse 8. Have a look at verse 8, because we're told there that the people ate, and afterwards the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. But the word basketful is not the same word that's used in chapter 6. In chapter 6, by the way, sorry, I should have put up the, there we are, in case you were forgotten it's about bread. There we are. In chapter 6, the word for basketful is a Jewish word, which is like a sort of knapsack that you slung over your shoulder and you carried your bread outside there. But here, the word for basket is actually a Gentile word. It refers to the big baskets that the Gentile merchants would use, and you could fit a whole person inside them. They're much bigger. So actually, 7 baskets could actually hold maybe even more bread than the 12 baskets that the Jews had. But it gives us a clue, I think, that actually the people that Jesus is talking to here are not the same. They're probably Gentiles. Now, have a look back in verse 31. Because from chapter 7. Because there, we're told that Jesus had left the vicinity of Tyre. Now, Tyre is up here. It's north of Israel. It's in Lebanon today. He'd left there, and he'd gone through Sidon, even further north, up here. So he's outside of Israel, and that's why he meets this Syrophoenician woman and the man who is deaf and dumb. And as we read on there, we see that actually, when we come to chapter 8, he is in the region of the Decapolis. In fact, if we go back to, chapter 7, verse 31, it says he left Tyre and Sidon and went into the region of the Decapolis, which you can see is over here. Okay, so he's gone to Tyre, Sidon, and then the Decapolis. He's still outside here from mainstream Israel. This area here was a very mixed area, a lot of Gentiles, some Jews as well, but I think predominantly a Gentile area. That explains why he uses this word, basketfuls, which is a Gentile word. That's what they'd have been used to in this area. And now we see perhaps one of the reasons why we have this feeding of the 4,000. In verse 27, he said to that woman, the Syrophoenician woman, "It's not right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs." "Yes, Lord," she replied, "but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he's very pleased with her answer. If you're not sure all about that, do listen to Bez's sermon from last week. But I think here is the point I'd like to make this morning. You might have thought if you were a Gentile, you were a second-class Christian. That the Jews get top table, and you're like a dog under the table licking up the crumbs. Actually, no. This feeding of the 4,000 is to remind us that Jesus hasn't just come to give crumbs to the Gentiles. He's come to give them a place at top table and to give them the fullness of the feeding that the Jews receive, not just crumbs, but this marvelous miracle with all these loaves produced and the fish, so that they can eat just as much as the Jews can from his hands. As much bread as they want. No limitations, not just crumbs anymore. And it's an important lesson here, isn't it, for us, that actually there is no favoritism in Jesus. There is bread for the Gentiles as well as for the Jews. He is not a God who separates Jews and Gentiles anymore. Outsiders are welcome. There are no cliques, or there shouldn't be any cliques in Christian churches. There are no second-class Christians, no second-class believers. Once you become a Christian, you are a child of God, a son or daughter who is on an equal level with anyone else. You may become a Christian today, and as someone here who's been a Christian for 40 or 50 years, you are, in God's eyes, on the same level as they are. That is the sort of God that we have, a Father who does not show favoritism. So I think Jesus here is making it very clear that the Gentiles are going to be fed on an equal basis to the Jews. We see that after that in verse 10, that he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Probably Dalmanutha is across the other side of Lake Galilee, so he's gone back to the Jewish side of Israel. And we can perhaps be sure of that because we see in verse 11, who comes to meet him? It's the Pharisees. So as he lands in the Jewish area, unsurprisingly, it's the Pharisees who meet him because they wouldn't live in the Decapolis. That's an unclean Gentile area for them. So they come in verse 11 and greet him and immediately ask for a sign from heaven. Isn't that daft? He's done all these miracles and he's just produced food. They haven't perhaps seen it themselves, but they'll have heard about it. They might have seen the 5,000 or heard people testifying about it. And they come and they ask for a sign from heaven. Maybe they wanted to hear an audible voice, God speak, and say, yes, this is Jesus, I've tested him, he's the one to put your faith in. Maybe they wanted that, an audible voice coming out of the clouds. Maybe they wanted him to, like Moses, when Moses performed the signs in Egypt, do you remember he produced those plagues on Pharaoh and the Egyptians? And maybe these Jews thought, well, actually, if you're a real second Moses, what you'll do is you'll raise a stick and you'll say, curse the Romans with frogs and with locusts and gnats, and then kill their firstborn because the Romans are the oppressors, a bit like the Egyptians were in the past. That will be a real sign they want, perhaps, from Jesus to show that who he really is. But of course, Mark tells us that they were testing him. They were testing him. Now, testing him, of course, can be good, as we saw earlier with the coins and the egg. Have you ever watched those gold medalists when in the Olympics, they get their gold medal, and what they do? They put it in their teeth, don't they? Like that, sometimes. Have you seen that? They're saying, yes, it's really gold. It's really gold because my teeth can't break it. Yeah, I tested it. It's not plastic. It's not bending. It's genuine gold. But once, of course, you've tested something and you're sure it's genuine, you don't go on testing it, do you? If it's the pound coin, you go and spend it. If it's the egg, you eat it. But here, they have no interest in that at all. They want to keep testing and testing and testing him because they don't really believe in him. They're not prepared to have faith in him. They're saying to Jesus, look, I want you to keep proving yourself over and over again until we are satisfied, until you can prove to our satisfaction that you are who you claim to be. They're acting like Satan does in Matthew chapter 4, in that wilderness, when Jesus is being tempted in the wilderness, and Satan says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from this temple, and God won't he'll make sure you don't get hurt. Angels will come and lift you up and make sure you don't dash your foot against a stone. And Jesus replies, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test. That's what Satan did. That's perhaps why he's damned. He will never have faith in Jesus. And the Pharisees are on that same path, aren't they? Prove yourself to us. Over and over again. We're not satisfied. If you're the Son of God. When we do that, we make ourselves, don't we, judges and arbiters. We're a bit like those judges on Strictly, aren't we? Craig and Bruno and Darcy. And come on, perform for us. Do your dance and we'll give you Craig Revel Hall 3, 4, or Bruno 8 or 9, isn't it? So I think that's what they've all changed, haven't they? Different people, I expect. But I live in the dark ages, that sort of thing. But you know what I mean? They are making themselves judges, and that's like we do for ourselves, don't we? We make ourselves judges. We expect God to perform in front of us as if he's a circus trick, a circus act, and we give marks out of 10. I wonder, if you just ask yourselves for a moment, do we ever test God like that? Do we ever read the Bible and say, well, I'm not really sure this is true, Lord. Can you give me a sign that confirms that what I'm reading really is the words of Jesus, that these really are, he did these miracles? If you're a non-Christian, you can ask that to a certain point, but actually when you look at the evidence and examine it, and Christianity invites you to do that, you come to a point, as people have done when they've looked at the resurrection, for instance. Atheists have come to the resurrection, examined it, and they've come away believing because the evidence is overwhelming. There comes a point when we have to stop testing. Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, this is writing to Christians, and he says, we should not test the Lord, as some of them did, the Israelites in the wilderness, and were killed by snakes. We looked at that, didn't we, earlier this year in Numbers 21. It's a danger for Christians that we can test the Lord ourselves. And look at verse 12, how Jesus responds to that. He sighed deeply. He sighed deeply. Literally, in the Greek, the word means groaned in his spirit. Jesus groaned in his spirit when these people asked this question. There was deep frustration in him. Deep frustration at their response to what he had done. It's a sign, of course, of unbelief. And so he says to them, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given to it. There comes a point when he will not keep offering evidence to you. The evidence is sufficient that we have. Make up your minds and believe, but don't keep testing him. It's interesting, you go back to the previous chapter again, verse 34 of chapter 7, and something similar happens there. When Jesus met this deaf and dumb man, he looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh, it's the same word, a deep groan, said to him, Ephatha, which means be opened. This groan is a groan of longing, isn't it? A deep sigh on his part that he wants this man to have his ears opened and his eyes open. Well, his eyes are open, but his ears and his tongue released. You've got two groans here, haven't you? A groan in his spirit of frustration and almost despair at these Pharisees. And then a groan of longing for this Gentile to have his hearing restored and his tongue loosened. When Jesus deals with us, which sigh, which groan is he using? Is it a groan of longing for us, or is it a groan of frustration? Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Verse 15, we're back to bread again, and the disciples have forgotten to bring bread, of course, and Jesus warns them. Be careful, he says. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Now, of course, Jesus isn't talking about physical bread here, isn't he? But spiritual bread. He's talking about our spiritual nourishment. Yeast, I think the children outside, if you're a parent out there, they're messing around, I think, with flour and yeast and that sort of thing this morning. But yeast actually, it's once it's in the bread, it's unseen, isn't it? And it's actually, although it's the element that helps the bread to rise, I've been reading about this week, all about bread this morning, helps it to rise, and all that carbon dioxide, ask me about it afterwards if you want to, but it's also a corrupting influence as well. Do you know that yeast is corrupting? If you put yeast in your bread and you leave it in the larder 4 or 5 days, 6, 7 days, it will go mouldy, won't it? Unleavened bread, without the yeast in it, can last for up to a month, apparently. So I read. But you see the difference there. Yeast here, what Jesus is talking about is something that actually is not seen when it's in the bread, but actually it is secret corrupting influence, and it permeates the whole loaf. It may rise, but it will go mouldy. It will go mouldy. And so he says here, look, I want you to look out for the teaching of the Pharisees. We've seen in Mark chapter 7, with their testing him about clean and unclean and all their rules, that they're people who are hypocrites. They hold on to human traditions. They're legalistic. They have, at the bottom, unbelief in their hearts. Herod, we saw him when he met John the Baptist, didn't we, and how he dealt with him. We've seen his worldliness, his sensuality, his desire to please the people. All of those things can infiltrate our hearts as well. It's a serious matter when it comes to the teaching of the church, because when that is corrupted, it ruins people's lives. Paul wrote to Titus when he was on Crete, and he spoke about some people there who were of the circumcision party. People are saying to Christians, you've got to be circumcised if you're going to be proper Christians. You've got to have the mark of the Old Testament in you as well as all that Paul teaches. And Paul said this to Titus. He said, this party are ruining whole households, ruining them in the church. You must stop them saying this because they're going to destroy the faith. And then he writes to Timothy later on, and he says this. There's a couple of people in the church, he says, Hymenaeus and Philetus. They're saying the resurrection has already happened. That's the resurrection of the dead, on that final day. It's already happened. And he says their teaching is spreading like gangrene. Gangrene. And that is an ugly picture, isn't it? Yeast is one thing, corrupting, making moldy bread, but gangrene, think of that in your human body. But that, he says, is what false teaching does to the church. It spreads like gangrene, and it destroys whole households. That is why Jesus here warns the disciples. If you're going to be my disciples, you're going to be the people who are going to found the church after my death. Look out. Look out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And the disciples think they're being told off, not bringing enough bread. They're like the husband who goes to the supermarket with his wife's list and comes back and has forgotten something and gets a real telling off when he gets back. You've forgotten that, you numpty. Okay. Jesus is very angry with them, isn't he? As well, verses 17 to 21. I wonder what the worst scolding, maybe apart from coming home without the full complement of goods from the supermarket. What's the worst scolding you've ever received in your life? Maybe you go back to your school times. You were told off there a time when teachers had real authority and could throw chalk at you and slip at you and cane you and stand you in the corner. Remember those comics where you used to have, was it the Bash Street Kids? And the teacher would sometimes send them, they have a stand in the corner with a big dunce cone on their head. Do you remember that at all? Some of you, perhaps, that was me you saying, yes, deja vu. I've been there. Maybe it was you. But that was the time, of course, when people did get told off really, and I can remember at school as well, when I got told off, I was so terrified sometimes of the teacher. Here, these people are being told off and made to feel really stupid as Jesus speaks to them and says, look, you can remember how many baskets were left over at the end, and you still think I've got a problem feeding the 12? I fed 5,000, I fed 4,000, and now you're thinking, oh, can he feed 12? What are you thinking, he's saying to them? It's not even about bread, of course, that he's talking, but if it was about bread, they're really, they've lost it, haven't they? They're a sandwich short of a picnic, you might say. And because they're unable to grasp this, because they're preoccupied with their own stomachs, with bread, they're incapable of receiving the real spiritual foods that Christ wants to give them. The teaching about yeast, about false teaching. They can't even begin to grasp that because they're so preoccupied with the physical and the material and the wife's shopping list and that sort of thing. Jesus holds them responsible for their ignorance. He lays into them. This is perhaps the worst occasion in their lives when they've been told off. This man who's taken them under his wing is now saying, you people of the book, you've been brought up on your mother's knee with your mother's milk to the stories of Abraham and Jacob and of David and of Moses and all that teaching. And what good has it been for you? You have me here, the Son of God, teaching you these things. And I need to treat you like you are a Gentile, deaf and dumb mute. You are so stupid. Your ears need opening like that poor man up there in Syrophoenicia, where I was previously. And here in verse 17 is the terrible bottom line. When he's asked them about this, he says to them in verse 17, "Are your hearts hardened? Are your hearts hardened?" Now, they are Jews. They'll know very well, back in the Old Testament, it's people like Pharaoh whose hearts were hardened. People who resisted God's will and ended up receiving God's wrath instead. And he asks them, are your hearts just like that? Are you going the same way as the Pharisees? Or are you going to be open to what I have to say to you? So when we think about these things, where would we fit in? You'll be glad to know there's no more bread now in Mark's Gospel until chapter 14, the Last Supper. He's finished his teaching about bread. But it is bread that Jesus wants to give us, food for our souls, real spiritual life. The words I have spoken to you, they are spirit and they are life, he says to the disciples after he's performed the miracle of the 5,000, feeding the 5,000 in John's Gospel. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God, he says in Matthew's Gospel. Will we receive that? The disciples here couldn't, could they? I think if you look at these two chapters together, or at least the second part of chapter 7 and this first part of chapter 8, you've got two types of people put before you. The Gentiles. You've got that Syrophoenician woman who is happy to consider herself a dog, a bitch. She doesn't mind that as long as she can lick up the crumbs under the table. And the deaf mute who's incapable of hearing or responding to anything. But you've got the groan of Jesus, the groan of longing that man has his ears and eyes opened. And his delight at the response of that Syrophoenician woman who has such faith just to lick up the crumbs. And then we have two types of Jew, don't we? The Pharisees, the guardians of the law of Moses, testing Jesus, testing and testing over and over again. And the disciples who are following him but are worried about where the nearest supermarket is. And there's a groan of despair and frustration from Jesus concerning them and a severe reprimand, a scolding for the disciples. Can I ask you, which category of those two fits you best? And can I suggest that it may be for some of you, I don't know how many, but I think it would be for some perhaps, that the second may be nearer to you because maybe you've never seen yourself as a dog. That's too low, isn't it? That is demeaning. Or you've never seen yourself as a spiritual cripple, someone who is deaf and dumb, who is completely helpless and hopeless and actually has nothing to offer at all, can do nothing to achieve salvation for him or herself. Most of us would say, I guess, we've been brought up to know right from wrong, wouldn't we? And to follow the Ten Commandments. And maybe the thing that exercises our minds even right now could be what we're going to have for lunch, or which restaurant to go to this week, or where we're going to book for holiday next summer, or which car we're going to place our car with this year, or which part of our home can we improve. And maybe we'll miss out on the real food and bread that Christ wants to give us. Jesus says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, about what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. And why do you worry about clothes? See how the lilies of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon, in all his splendor, was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? Because the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Let's pray.